Hey D Group leaders, this is week 4 of our John highlight series, which means we're doing John chapters 5 through 6, which are massive chapters, but there's a lot in there and a lot of good stuff. So our memory verse is John 5:18. I always encourage you to start there with each of your weekly D groups. Is start with a memory verse and you start it. Don't wait for anybody else to do it. You do it. And it's 5:18 that says, and this is why the Jews wanted to kill Jesus all the more, were seeking to kill him all the more, because not only was he performing miracles on the Sabbath, not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he called God his Father and made himself equal to God. Okay, so not the smoothest, but listen, as long as we get it memorized, that's what matters. Okay, so you put it out there, let everybody else go. Then you do the back. All right, how did everybody do this past week? You look back, then you look up. We're going to go to the text, and then you look forward. Let's talk about the life of the church, things that everybody needs to know, stuff like that. So let's jump in real fast to John 5 through 6. So, if you remember from last week, I said the tail end of 4 actually kind of belongs with 5, because that's when Jesus begins his miracle ministry. And it's not that he wasn't performing miracles before that, but now his ministry is going to be kind of marked by those miracles. And the reason he does that is they're signs. It's not just so that he can say, oh, look, I have powers and abilities. It's so that the people can know that he is God. And we're going to see that as he teaches them in the midst of miracles. So he would do a miracle, and that would kind of be his hook. That would be like, oh, I want to go see that, right? Everyone has to come and see Jesus now. And then he would teach. He would hook with a miracle, and then he would teach them the gospel, and then they would respond. So in chapter 5, we start out, and Jesus is going up to Jerusalem, and he's going to go to the sheep gate pool, and in Aramaic it's called Bethesda. Now let me give you a little backstory on that. So they believed that once a year an angel would come down and touch the waters, and the waters would bubble up, and the first person to get into those waters would be healed of whatever issue they were dealing with. So that's why it says in verse 3 that a multitude of invalids, people who can't move, and they would refer to them as the blind, lame, and the paralyzed, people who couldn't physically move or could not see in order to move, didn't know where they were going. And so they would try to get in to the water, and there's this guy who's been there for 38 years. And he's never been able to make it into the water. Now, we don't really know if anything actually happened or not. Maybe it did, but Jesus, however, sees this guy, and he sees him sitting there, and he asks him this odd question. He says, do you want to be healed? And of course, that seems like a no-brainer. Of course, Jesus, we want to be healed. We want to experience the healing and the miracle. But Jesus asks him, do you want to be healed? And he grants the guy healing. He gets up and he says, now take your bed and walk home. Go home. And so the importance of this is that he tells the guy to do this on the Sabbath. Now the rabbis, they had a special rule that you could not walk over a certain distance, and you could not carry anything, because that was considered work, and working is wrong on the Sabbath. And so they would set up these extra rules just to make sure you didn't break the rule. So the rule is keep the Sabbath and keep it holy, right? And so that is the fourth commandment. And so the rule is don't break the Sabbath, okay? So then an added rule is, well, you shouldn't work on the Sabbath because it's a day of rest. Okay, well, if you're not going to work on the Sabbath because it's a day of rest, then you should, let's not walk any further than blah, or let's not carry anything further than, and they would just create these rules, these arbitrary rules to keep you from working because it was a day of rest, because you're supposed to keep the Sabbath holy, okay? So you see, it's kind of these ridiculous legalistic rules. And Jesus knows this, of course. He knows what the rules are. He knows what the culture says. And so he does this intentionally to tick off the Pharisees and Sadducees, the religious leaders. And of course, they see this guy walking, carrying his mat. And they're like, notice, it says, who told you to take up your bed and walk, as verse 12. They didn't even ask him, wow, we know that you've been here for a long time, 38 years. This is incredible that you're walking. Nope. Hey, why are you breaking the rule that we enforce? So it's a power struggle. And so, of course, He doesn't know, but he sees Jesus later. Jesus then kind of, because he's already stirred up things, and if you watch The Chosen, he says sometimes you have to stir up the waters, right? And so he comes back and he says, see, you're well. All right, now go and sin no more. And that guy has faith because of Jesus. And that's when we get to our persecution verse in verse 16, 17. They persecuted Jesus because he was doing stuff on the Sabbath. But then they wanted to kill Jesus, verse 18, because he, one, was doing stuff on the Sabbath, which broke the rules, and they were offended by that, but mostly because he was claiming God as his Father, and that made him equal to God. So do not miss this in your D group. Everyone understands that Jesus is equal to God, even the people who he's talking to. Jesus, and in this case John, is using language to communicate that Jesus is equal to God. This is not something that we invented as Christians later. It comes all the way from the very first eyewitnesses. Okay? Now let's talk about the authority of the Son. So now they're going to get into this argument. Okay? So you've got these religious leaders and Jesus, and they're just going to hash it out. Jesus intentionally would pick fights with the religious leaders. Like he didn't happen to walk into one. A lot of times he would create one. Okay? And so he starts making a lot of claims here. So just look into these here. Verse 20, the Father loves the Son and shows him all that he himself is doing. Okay, verse 21, for as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, so also the Son gives life to whom he will. And then verse 23, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father, or that people will worship the Son as they worship the Father. And so Jesus is saying, I'm doing this so that you will worship me and know who I am. Now, that is a really crazy, bold statement for someone to make, unless he's God. Because if I were to say, or anyone else were to say, hey, you should worship me, that's ridiculous. I'm a loony if I'm saying something like that. Unless I really am who I say I am. Hence, the miracles. Jesus does the miracles to prove who he is so that he can make these claims. Now, the thing is, they reject him because they don't like the kind of God that he is. They want power, they don't want truth, okay? So that's kind of that portion. And he begins to talk about authority, executing judgment, because he is the Son of Man. Okay, that is directly lifted out of the book of Daniel, where it says, I shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with judgment. Okay, so the fact that Jesus is here and that Jesus is present, he's not here to make happy stuff happen. Okay? He's not here to be ooey gooey lovey Jesus here. He's here to cause division because he's here for judgment. He's claiming out judgment on these guys. And so then we talk about, okay, so if we're going to talk about the authority of Jesus, let's talk about someone who witnessed about Jesus, and that is John the Baptizer. So in the next portion, verses 30 through the end of chapter 5, he talks about the baptizer, and the baptizer came to prepare everyone for Jesus, okay? And a lot of people liked what John had to say, the baptizer, but the reason they didn't like that Jesus came was because they thought John was talking about a king who would come. John was thinking that this guy's going to throw off Rome and he's going to establish a kingdom and maybe an army and stuff like that, all right? So that's what people thought that John was saying. John wasn't saying that, but that's what people thought until Jesus really got there and says, no, I'm not here to attack Rome or politics or raise an army and go to war. He's saying, I'm here to free you from your sin, which again is something that only God can do. And just because they did not believe in John, so you also did not believe in me. And so rejecting Jesus and who he is. And then he says something even more interesting towards the end of chapter 5. He says, there's another one who accuses you, Moses. So Moses is the one who received the law on Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments, and all of the laws that these guys are making laws, like keep the Sabbath. And if you're going to keep the Sabbath, then you have to rest. And if you're going to rest, then you can't work or walk. And if you can't work or walk, then you can't carry stuff for a certain distance or travel a certain distance, right? And so they've created all these extra rules based off of what they got from Moses. And Jesus is saying, listen, if you really believed in Moses, you would really believe in me. Because Moses tells you about me. He predicts that I'm coming. And if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words, is what he says. All right, so that's chapter 5. Let's jump into chapter 6. This is kind of going to continue that message of feeding the 5,000, the miracle. So he hooks with a miracle, and then he teaches, okay? And then, of course, he's rejected. That's kind of like his pattern. All right, so he's going to feed the 5,000. He's at the Sea of Galilee, which apparently now, at the writing of this, when John writes this, Sea of Galilee is now known as Sea of Tiberias, which means this is probably after AD 70, when Rome has come in and destroyed Jerusalem and renamed it to Palestine. And so recreated an entire new territory because of the Jewish uprising and revolt. So they named it after Caesar Tiberius. Okay, so he's kind of giving them like some context here. All right, so there's this large crowd and they're following Jesus, and he's doing all these signs. Okay, he was doing this for their sick so that he could heal them. All right, that word again, sign, is to prove who he is. It's an identity-shaping event. So then he starts to teach. Then after he teaches, he realizes, man, they're hungry. They've been here all day. And so what does he do? He says, okay, let's feed them. Goes to Philip. Philip, let's feed them. Philip says, hey, that's impossible. Even if I had 200 denarii, which is like 200 days' wages, almost a year's salary, I could not feed this many people, Jesus. And Jesus says, well, what do we have? Andrew then shows up with the 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. And a barley loaf was not a big loaf, it was a small loaf. Okay, so this is like some little kid's snack or lunch. Okay, Jesus then breaks it, feeds 5,000 people, and it's actually 5,000 men. We read other places. So you're talking about women, children. So there's a large crowd, probably 10 to 20,000 at this point. Okay, so Jesus does all this. And then he says, okay, now go get the leftovers. They go get the leftovers, and they fill up 12 baskets. Why would it be 12? Well, because there's 12 apostles. He says, all of you people who said it couldn't be done, not only did I do it, but here's some leftovers for you. So that you can see I could do this. And I could do way beyond even what you thought I could do. So he feeds everybody, and then he says, okay, I need some time. I need to take a break. Because in look at 15, it says, perceiving then that they were, the crowd, were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So in other words, these people, they wanted a Messiah so bad that they were about to force Jesus, like a mob, to become a king, a geopolitical king, to take on Rome and free them from Rome. He didn't want to do that. That's not his goal. So he eludes them and goes off and hides. So then that evening, while Jesus is hiding, he sends his disciples back across the sea. They're going back across, and then that's whenever a windstorm comes up and they can't get all the way across. So Jesus then comes out to them walking on the water. Now there's more story to this in the other gospel accounts. But the real purpose of that is just simply that Jesus says, don't be afraid. If I told you to do this, it's possible. I'm with you. And if I told you to do this, then all you have to do is be obedient. And so he proves himself yet again, another sign to prove who he was to his disciples. Next day, the crowd that was on one side of the lake that wanted the food comes back, and they've found him now in Capernaum, okay? And they said, hey, Rabbi, where did you come from? How'd you get here? And he's like, I live here. You guys came over here and you found me, right? Okay, so they come over, and he says, truly, truly, I say to you, verse 26, you are seeking me not because you saw signs. In other words, not because you saw even the miracles or because you believe, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. In other words, you ate all the food. And he says, do not work for the food that perishes. In other words, you eat for a bit and then you're hungry again. But for the food that endures to eternal life. In other words, seek faith. And again, he's going to throw in that title, which the Son of Man will give you. For on him, God the Father has set his seal. That's an authoritative statement. Like think a seal of wax where you would take a signet ring and make a seal on it. Okay? Or the seal of the United States. Like it's a symbol of power and authority. So Jesus is saying, put your faith in me. God has given me the authority to grant you eternal life if you'll put your faith in me. Instead, that's not really what they want. They want more food, right? They said, so they said to him, then what sign do you do that we may see and believe you? What work do you perform? And he says, "Oh, I know, our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." So listen to this. They're like, okay, we hear you, Jesus. We want to believe in you, but you got to prove to us that, you're really God. And so you got to have to do a sign to prove that you're really God. Like, oh, I got it. Bread from heaven. In other words, they come around looking for bread. Jesus says, hey, you're not here because you really believe in me. You want bread. And they're like, no. And then he says, yeah, that's exactly what it is. And they said, well, okay, we'll believe in you. We just need a sign. And you know what? Just make bread? Like, they're not even trying to be slick about this. They're just like, just give us some bread, Jesus. Okay? And so he then is going to go into this really interesting passage where he talks about, he's like, I am the bread of life. All right, verse 35. And he says, whoever comes to me shall not hunger. Whoever believes in me shall not thirst. So he says, I'm the bread of life. Okay? Then he goes down, verse 41. So the Jews grumbled about him because he said, I am the bread that came down from heaven. So he's saying, fine, you want bread from heaven, the manna from heaven? I'm the manna from heaven. Me, talking about spiritual, not physical. And they're upset because they wanted physical bread. He's saying, I'm the spiritual bread. And they're getting all annoyed. Okay, so Jesus says, do not grumble among yourselves. I will raise them up on the last day, and they will be taught by God. Okay, so then keep on going down, verse 48, I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, and they have died. Right? Then this is the bread that comes down from heaven so that one may eat of it and not die. So they ate the manna because it's just bread, and they died. He's saying, if you eat of me, I'm the living bread. He's talking very metaphorically. They just don't like the metaphor. They want real bread. He says, if you trust in me, then you won't die, meaning spiritually you'll have eternal life. Then this is really when it begins to get weird. Okay, verse 51. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of this world is my flesh, my body. He's saying, I'm the bread, and I'm going to give you my bread. It's going to be my body, me, my body. Okay? And then look down again where he says in 53, so Jesus says to them, truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in him. Okay, so now as Christians, we understand he's talking about the Lord's Supper that he's going to establish later, where it's symbolic that he says, I am the bread of life. I am the blood that saves you. So in other words, the fact that Jesus dies for you with his body, his physical body dies, he literally sheds his blood for you. He becomes the sacrifice that rescues us from our sin. These people don't get it, though. They don't have that context. They don't understand that this is what Jesus is saying. He says, well, if you eat my body and drink my blood, then you can have eternal life. And they're like, that's weird. I don't want to do that. That sounds gross. Okay? And so he continues just to keep talking about this, that you'll live forever. All right, and so then in the last section, look down in verse 66. After this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. They turned back and no longer walked with him. In other words, they said, we're not going there with you, Jesus. We're not doing the whole eat your body, drink your blood. That sounds weird. That sounds culty. I'm not doing that, Jesus. But what Jesus is doing, he's trying to say, listen, you've seen the signs. You've seen me do things. You've seen me teach, yet you won't believe. And now some do believe, and they continue on, and they follow him. But the massive crowds, the 5,000, the massive amount of people, they're not following Jesus anymore. And that sounds counterproductive. He's not seeking fame, because if he was seeking fame, he would have said something softer, something easier, so that they might seek him and continue to follow him. But instead, he's trying to create division. He's trying to prove to them who he is so that they might respond in faith and find eternal life. So we're going to keep on going. We're going to address the Feast of the Booths. So another bonus tip that you can know is that John organizes his book according to the feasts and the festivals. So we just came through the Sabbath. So here we're proving that Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. Okay, now we're going to get to Feast of Booths in chapter 7, which is next week. And we're going to talk about how Jesus is Lord of that festival. And we're going to continue on in that pattern so that Jesus is kind of proven as this very legitimate fulfillment of the Old Testament and of the hope of the Jews. So hope this is great. Go make some disciples.